I leave immediately the floor to Massimo Leone that present have a presentation entitled "The Right Face of Food: Semiotic Ideologies of Orientation in Everyday Life." Massimo, you have 20 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Sedda, Mr. Chair, and many thanks to Simona Stano, Professor Simona Stano in particular, for organizing such a wonderful lecture. She's always absolutely stalwart, whatever she does. So food and face hold multiple relations. Food is primarily what sustains life, and face is essentially a device, perhaps the most important one, to look for food or to escape from becoming food in the environment. In the frame of language, meaning, and cultures, this basic relation complexifies, although it still impacts on subsequent developments. They can be arranged according to Algerdas-Julien-Grimes's generative path and structural semiotics. Starting from the most superficial, food can acquire a face, as it has been explored by Professor Simona Stano herself in several works, and especially in a recent article entitled Face in Food, Pareidolia, Iconism, and Meaning. Food can receive a face intentionally, for instance, when a cookie is given chocolate eyes, nose, and mouth, or can manifest one unintentionally, for instance, when the face of Jesus is seen in a piece of burnt toast. In both cases, the typical plastic configuration of a face, whose philosophical properties have been commented upon by Deleuze and Guattari in Mille Plateaux, emerge in the material structure of food, either because it is so arranged on purpose or spontaneously, and gives rise in food to the figure of a face. The result materializes and visualizes at a plastic, figurative, and iconic level another essential relation between face and food. Food can manifest a face, but a face can also become food. When it does so metaphorically through either the plastic hazard of a pareidolia or the artifice of a food designer, this relation is somehow sublimated by its subsumption at the purely visual level. It is, however, a brutal relation, and essentially one that is underlain by the primary dialectics between a subject and an object. In natural evolution, indeed, the continuous struggle between predators and prey ultimately is a struggle between faces and food. In the natural environment, a living being is either a face looking for food and sex for surviving and reproducing, or it becomes food for other faces. In cognitively complex animals and dramatically in human beings, face and food can hardly coexist. As I've shown in a paper entitled On the Face of Food, first presented in New York at a splendid conference organized therein by Amy Bentley and Simona Stano on October 14-15, 2019, about to appear in a volume issuing from the conference and edited by the two scholars. As soon as a face is turned into food, it immediately loses its phenomenological and ethical qualities of face, which are incompatible with the practices of eating, with few, mostly horrific exceptions. Food cultures in the world eat heads, not faces, and even heads are quite rare, more and more excluded from the realm of food in complex and industrialized societies. My main point in that article was that the progressive exclusion of heads and therefore faces from contemporary food, with few mostly archaic exceptions, results from the somewhat hypocritical desire of concealing or adulterating the brutal subject-object relation between face and food. When humans eat other non-human animals, the former ultimately partake in the annihilation of the latter's faces, that is, what allows animals to live and reproduce through nourishment and sex. Hiding signs of faces from food means distancing the disquieting truth that surviving constantly depends on the annihilation of other living beings. As I've shown in the article Digiunare, istruzioni per l'uso, fasting instruction for usage Published in Italian journal EC in 2013, Jainism takes the awareness of the inherently violent nature of food to the utmost, designating ritual self-starvation as the noblest way of ending one's life. Indeed, vegetarians, vegans, or other categories of human eaters abstaining from eating faces, or rather to turning faces into food, yet this is true only at a certain level, as I've indicated in the article on muzzles and faces, published in a special issue of the International Journal for the Semiotics of Law on Personhood, edited by Jenny Ponzo. A long and complex philosophical reflection, which in its contemporary developments starts from Levinas and continues with Deleuze and Guattari, Derrida, and more recently Donna Haraway, bears on the question whether non-human animals have a face or not. As soon as human beings singularize a non-human animal, as in the case of a pet, for instance, they start to see his or her face and not only its muzzle, and therefore to be squeamish about the idea of eating them, more and more so in contemporary societies. These and other phenomena vividly indicate that distinguishing between human faces and non-human muzzles essentially results from a deep-seated semiotic ideology common across all human cultures, which established the human exclusivity and the exclusion of other non-human animals also through the dialectics between the face and a muzzle. A muzzle is essentially a face one can dispose of, so that muzzling someone means turning it into the object of an asymmetric relation of power, akin to the one underpinning the evolutionary dialectics between faces and food. A living being is stripped of his or her face and given a muzzle, and ipso facto it can be eaten without too much remorse. Vice versa, a non-living being is given a face, like in the case of the festive almond cakes in the shape of lumps that were the object of the incipit of my New York lecture, and ipso facto eating it becomes a taboo, or at least must be framed by ritual so as to tame remorse. The English native speaker is probably not as aware as the Roman languages one of the etymological root of the word remorse, which indicates a biting again. Paraphrasing Ernesto de Martino's splendid title on Southern Italian Tarantism, La Terra del Rimorso, one could say that ogni morso è un rimorso, meaning that every bite entails a possibility of moral remorse about the necessity of sustaining one's life through terminating the life of other beings. In Food, Meaning and the Law, subtitled Confessions of a Vegan Semiotician, I've explained my personal choice of abstaining from food that used to be part of an organism endowed with a face. This simple rule does not rule out some problematic cases, like those of animals whose face is not visually arranged like those of mammals. For some of these tricky cases, a keener observation is sufficient to dispel any doubt. Who can deny, after seeing the Academy Award winner My Octopus Teacher, that octopuses have a face? But what about the face of oysters or sea urchins? Should I yield to my brothers and sisters to eat pasta with sea urchins, a delicacy of coastal Salento, just because, as he claims, sea urchins are not really animals? I ricci non sono animali. On the occasion of a congress of the Italian Association of Semiotic Studies held in Siena, October 25-27, 2019, I presented a keynote on ventriloquism, in which I claimed that the dignity of life should not be recognized in a scopocentric way, that is, by bestowing a face uniquely to those creatures that are able to receive a representation of the world through their eyes. Instead, more generally, such dignity should be seen every time that the mouth, of whatever shape and functioning, opens onto the world looking for food. As I suggested in the talk, which is about to be published in French in a festschrift dedicated to a major French semiotician, whose name I cannot reveal here in order not to spoil the surprise, life essentially is an open mouth, or better, a mouth that can open, a definition that entails, among other things, also the possibility to define the attempts at a non-violent ethics, at a non-subjugating politics, as those in which mouths are open not onto food but onto language. It is indeed quite extraordinary and certainly deserves much philosophical reflection that the valve through which human beings receive food and air is also that which is used to express language. I've examined the spiritual implications of this valve in a long essay entitled Science of the Soul, published in the journal Science and Society in 2013. As my philosophical investigation of the face evolves, however, mainly in the frame of the ERC project Facets, which I direct at the University of Turin, I feel the urge to further expand my definition of face, also stimulated by a recent lecture that I gave in the frame of Italian celebration of Dante's 700th death anniversary. Dante used all the Italian words for face. He used viso, which at his epoch had and today only partially retains a deep etymological and semantic relation with visio. Viso for Dante, like its equivalents in other languages, including the English visage, links the semantic definition of a face with its being both the source of vision, what is primarily offered to the vision of others, and what is primarily seen of others. My visage is that from which I see, that which I first see in others, and that which others first see. But Dante also used the volto, which at his time had a more concrete meaning, linked with that of volgere, to turn, and therefore to the idea of directing one's attention to a face, or the attention of others to one's face, a word that has no equivalence in English. And Dante then used sembiante, which hinted at the changing phenomenology of a face and has an English equivalent in semblant. Finally, the Commedia and the other works by the Italian poet also contain the word faccia, which in Dante's lexicon had to do precisely with the idea of facet, or to say it in more semiotic terms, with the idea of aspect or even aspectuality. That is, the point of view from which a face is looked at, but also the idea that a face consists in the partiality of a point of view. As I pointed out in the introduction of a special issue of Lexia published in 2017 and devoted to the concept of aspectuality, Peirce's definition of what a sign is crucially involves the idea of an internal, mental, and cognitive aspect, that is, a respect or angle from which the object is signified, the ground in relation to which an interpretant turns it into the origin of semiosis. If one considers this extremely enlarged acceptance of the word face as facet, as angle, as respect from which meaning is received, then every sign ends up having a face. And the human face ends up being just the most macroscopic manifestation of a semiotic mechanism that is much more general and present not only among humans and not exclusively among non-human animals or living beings, but also among non-living objects. More generally, indeed, everything that is involved in semiosis starts having a facet or face, and semiotics itself can be redefined as the discipline that studies everything that has a face, given this enlarged definition of it. It is the partiality itself of perception that grants everything that is perceived a face, yet this phenomenological partiality also begets an axiology. Reality is received as meaningful because it is received as multifaceted, yet this multiplicity is never neutral. Living and non-living beings are linked by a sort of phenomenological magnetism through which some facets of reality acquire a positive connotation entailing attraction, whereas others exude a negative connotation implying repulsion. Design seeks to master the secrets of this mysterious system and to enshrine them in its creations. Specialists define as affordances the ways in which designed objects seek to predetermine the facets through which they will be seen, thought of, desired, and used. The notion of affordance, however, is also the particular instance of a much more general category. The human face, for instance, also is an affordance. It is the affordance that biological evolution has selected as the best fit in natural evolution and subsequently in cultural acceptation. By showing our face to others or by looking at others' faces, by predisposing our face to be seen or by judging how others' faces have been predisposed to be seen, we implicitly yield to a very long natural and cultural selection that has turned the face into a formidable affordance of both biological and social interaction. If we cover our face, as during the pandemic, then we contradict the deep-seated laws of this primary affordance of our own body. Yet, if every face is an affordance, then the contrary is also true. Every affordance entails a face. From this point of view, then, face can be defined as the respect from which an object implicitly requires to be considered and turned into sign, into a ground for semiosis. Fabricated objects therefore start having a face. In many circumstances, it is evident where the face of the object is. In a car, for instance, design pushes us to identify not only a front and a back, but also sort of a face with the two lights as big luminous eyes and the mouth just above the plate. Here's, as a consequence, a further possible relation between food and face. Food can be given or stripped a face at the figurative or plastic level of visual meaning. It can be attributed or denied a face in the subject-object relation between predators and prey. But food also has a face at the more abstract, general level, which is that of the axiology resulting from the natural and cultural affordances of food itself. A banana, for instance, does not have a face, although it is frequently given one in popular cultural artifacts like comics, cartoons, or advertising. Yet it certainly has affordances, which stem from its natural shape, as well from the necessity of grabbing, holding, peeling, and biting it so as to eat it. Humanity, therefore, is divided by an axiology of affordances, depending on whether a banana is peeled starting from its upper facet or from its lower one. As we have learned from Jacobson, Hemslow, Calabrese, and others, symbolical polarities often turn into semi-symbolical axiologies. Since a banana can be peeled starting from above or starting from below, it can therefore become good or bad eating it starting from either extremity. The projection of facial affordances on food therefore involves vegetables too. The way we grab a tomato, wash it, put it on a cutting board, chop it, and toss it into a salad has many alternatives, yet one of them is selected as appropriate since it approaches the vegetable from the right side. This axiological determination of food is even more compelling in the case of food that is clearly fabricated. It is evident, for instance, in the case of bread. The bibliography on the symbolical meaning of bread is extensive. Its shapes, in particular, have attracted the attention of anthropologists. And as Consuelo Manetta points it out in her 2016 article, Our Daily Bread in Italy, Its Meaning in the Roman Period and Today, I quote, the very shape of a loaf of bread often assumes symbolic meaning. Many ceremonial breads of Sardinia, Francisco wakes up, are shaped as animals, fruits, or vegetables. They metaphorically remind the offering of first fruits. These values are also related to life's evolution and to mating practices linked to sexual reproduction. End of quote. On the shape of Sardinian bread, in particular, the famous Italian anthropologist Alberto Maria Cirese published in 1997 the article Arte plastica effimera, I pani sardi, in the collection of essays Oggetti, Segni, Musei, published by Naudi in the same year. In it, the anthropologist expounded on a reading that was clearly inspired by semiotics and that had found its definitive formulation in the 1992 essay by Cirese himself, Il pane cibo e il pane segno, in the edited volume Antropologia e Storia dell'Alimentazione, Il pane, edited by Cristina Papa. In it, Cirese writes that la sagoma, lo spessore, la dimensione del pane è quasi sempre simbolica, anche nei pani quotidiani. La forma non nutre, veicola informazione e non calorie. End of quote. In a more recent contribution published in 2007 and entitled La tradizione e l'uso del pane nel Mediterraneo, spunti per un'indagine antropologica, Italian anthropologist Paolo Palmeri dwells at length on the symbolical meaning of bread shapes and to the superstitions linked with them. He reports that in Sicily, bread must not be put upside down on the table. I quote, non si mette rovesciato sulla tavola perché è come se si volgessero le spalle al Signore. End of quote. In an article entitled Consumo di pane nella società dei consumi, published by Tullio Seppilli in the already mentioned 1992 collection edited by Cristina Papa, the author contends that the custom originated from the desire or the fear not to cover the sign of the cross that was commonly incised on a loaf of bread during its baking. A popular tradition places the origin of the superstition precisely in Turin, where it would have first spread from where it would have first spread as a consequence of an edict by Charles VII, which obliged bakers to sell bread to hangmen, to executioners, ai boia, since nobody would accept to have such job anymore, given that bakers would not sell them bread, since they were associated with death and thought of to bring bad luck. Bakers in Turin therefore started to place loaves of bread reserved to hangmen upside down so as to distinguish them from others. Some traditions even link the invention of pain carré to some baker's intention to create a bread that could not be reversed, that could not bring bad luck. These and similar etiologies are probably far-fetched, but confirm that the form of bread, especially in Italy, contains a right face and a good face, as well as it contains a wrong face and a bad face, which work also as affordances when bread has to be put on the table or eaten in the form of a sandwich. There is a specific face of the sandwich that you have to show to the external world when you eat one. The deepest semiotic meaning of this axiology, however, is to be looked for elsewhere and not in these popular traditions. I mean, semiotics must start from these traditions, but must not, of course, accept them as causes of the meaning of this superstition. Starting from the observation contained in the article by Massimo Montanari, La cultura del pane. Montanari writes that, and here I see, I have seen, I think, Ugo Voldi among the audience, and I will end with a hint to his work, but also somehow to the necessity of a cooperative study, because Montanari writes that, I quote, the Jews had with bread un atteggiamento culturalmente ambiguo. Da un lato il pane rappresentava una fondamentale risorsa dell'alimentazione quotidiana, dall'altro era incluso in quanto cibo fermentato, cioè corrotto rispetto alla purezza originale della materia prima, tra i prodotti che non potevano godere di uno statuto ideologico alto, sacrale. So this historical reference encouraged me to rethink the issue of the affordance of bread, its right face and superstition in different terms, also on the basis of other references. My final point is this one. If there is a right face of food, of bread, and a wrong face of bread, if there is a superstition about not reversing bread upside down on the table, it is because it is a certain kind of bread that has an asymmetric shape. And this asymmetric shape is exactly leavened bread. In cultures in which there is no leavened bread and bread is symmetric, recently I got engaged with a woman, a girl from Venezuela. We eat arepas, for instance, and arepas are a sort of corn bread with no asymmetries because there is no leavening involved. But when bread is leavened, it develops an asymmetric shape, and as a consequence, it develops also an internal semi-symbolic system. So the part of the bread that leavens up, it is associated with growth, with life, with the sun, with wealth, and this is the beginning of the inverse tradition, superstition of not reversing the bread. So this is my contribution to the anthropological debate on this particular tradition. And with this, I wish you all the best with the prosecution of works.